I had never been afraid of the woods before. As a child, I spent hours running through forests, letting the trees swallow me whole, finding comfort in the thick blanket of leaves above. The smell of damp earth and pine was as familiar as the scent of my mother's cooking. But that night, something was different. It started just after sunset. The cool breeze, which had felt refreshing when I first set off, had turned into something colder, something unsettling. I had gone for a hike alone, something I had done countless times before. But tonight, the forest felt like it was closing in around me, like the trees were leaning in, watching, waiting. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one here. The path beneath my boots was uneven and covered in moss. The trees towered overhead, their bare branches reaching out like skeletal hands. I had been walking for hours, lost in my thoughts, my mind as deep in the woods as my body. The sun had slipped completely behind the horizon, and the darkness seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. It wasn't just the absence of light that made me uneasy. It was the way the shadows moved. It was subtle at first, just a flicker in the corner of my vision. I thought it was nothing more than the wind rustling the trees. But as I continued deeper into the woods, the flickering became more deliberate, like a shadow was following me. Every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. But I knew something was wrong. My heart began to beat faster, and I forced myself to shake it off. The further I walked, the more the air seemed to thicken, the silence around me pressing in like a weight. I couldn't hear any animals, no birds, no insects, not even the occasional rustle of leaves as small creatures moved through the underbrush. It was as though the forest had suddenly held its breath. I stopped and took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. There was a clearing up ahead, and I decided to make my way toward it. Maybe I just needed to sit down for a minute, take a break, and clear my mind. But as I approached the clearing, I felt it again, the feeling of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the thought that I wasn't alone anymore. I stepped into the clearing, the soft crunch of dead leaves beneath my boots the only sound. The moon was full tonight, casting pale light across the grass and the trees surrounding the clearing. For a moment, I let myself relax. But then something caught my eye, movement, just beyond the trees at the edge of the clearing. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. But when I looked, there was nothing there. I swallowed hard. It was probably just an animal, a deer maybe, or a fox. I took a few more steps forward, my eyes scanning the shadows, still feeling that nagging sense of being watched. My breath came out in short gasps, and I began to feel like I was no longer alone, that the forest was alive in ways I couldn't understand. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and I found myself unable to shake the sense that the forest was changing around me. I glanced back toward the path I had come from, hoping to make my way back to the relative safety of familiar ground. But as I turned, something made me freeze. The path was no longer visible. The trees had grown taller, their trunks thicker, their branches twisting in unnatural ways. The clearing, too, had changed. It felt smaller now, as if the trees had crept closer without me noticing. The ground beneath my feet felt wrong, too. It wasn't just the usual layer of dead leaves and moss I had walked on. It was soft and spongy, like the earth itself had begun to shift. I took a step back, panic rising in my chest. The moonlight was still there, but now it felt distant, as though the world around me had been cast into a shadow that stretched just beyond my reach. I spun around again, but the clearing was no longer where I had thought it was. The trees had taken over the space, and the path I had walked on was completely gone. I stumbled backward, the air suddenly thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. I had to get out. I had to. But then I heard it. A sound, so faint that it might have been the wind, but there was something in it, something different. A rustling, as if something large was moving through the brush just beyond the trees. I stopped, holding my breath, came again, closer this time. The sound of something dragging its feet through the undergrowth, a heavy, deliberate pace. I stood motionless, my heart thundering in my chest, my body locked in place. I had to move. I couldn't stay here. I turned sharply to my right, trying to orient myself, but the moment I took a step, the sound stopped. I froze. There was no wind, no rustling leaves. The silence returned, even heavier than before. My body tensed, my muscles aching from holding still for so long. My head whipped around in every direction, but I saw nothing. Only trees, shadows, and the dark sky above. The trees were closing in again, their trunks so thick now that they seemed to merge with each other. The air was growing colder, and I could feel it creeping under my skin, wrapping itself around my bones. I turned around and ran. I don't know why I ran. I didn't even know where I was running to. I just knew I couldn't stand there anymore. The ground beneath my feet was uneven, the earth shifting beneath my boots, and I stumbled again and again, each time getting up quicker, moving faster. I couldn't think about anything except putting distance between myself and whatever it was I had felt in those woods. The path was gone now. The familiar landmarks I had passed earlier all vanished. The trees around me felt like they were moving, pressing in tighter with every step I took. I ran until my chest burned, until my legs screamed at me to stop, but I couldn't. Suddenly, I broke through the trees and found myself in a small ravine. The forest opened up around me, but there was no way out. The ground was too steep, the climb too dangerous. My only option was to keep moving, to press forward, but the dread, the feeling of being followed, of being hunted, was too much. I turned around, panting, looking back over my shoulder, half expecting something to be standing just behind me. But the space was empty. The forest was still, and for a moment, I thought I might have imagined it all. But then I heard something. A crack, sharp and unmistakable, from somewhere above me. I looked up. The tree branches above me shifted, and someone stepped into view, just on the edge of the cliff. I couldn't see their face, just the shadow of a figure, hunched and waiting. Their presence was so wrong, so foreign, that my body froze in place. There was no mistaking it now. The forest was alive, and it was not alive in any way that I understood. My legs gave out beneath me, and I collapsed to the ground. The last thing I remember was the figure's eyes, gleaming faintly in the moonlight, before everything went black. When I woke, the forest was quiet again. There was no sign of the figure. No sounds, no rustling of leaves, no signs of anything having been there at all. I stood slowly, the ache in my body from running still there, and I looked around. The trees were back to their normal, familiar positions. Took me hours, but I finally made my way out of the woods. My legs were shaking, my body exhausted, but I had made it. The sun was rising as I stumbled out of the forest, the last remnants of night still clinging to the trees. And I knew, without a doubt, that I would never set foot in those woods again. The feeling of being watched, the sense of something out there, something watching, something waiting, it had been real, and it would stay with me forever. I wasn't alone in those woods, and I never would be again. The night had fallen quicker than I expected. One moment, the forest was bathed in the warm glow of late afternoon, and the next, I was surrounded by nothing but darkness. The path, which had seemed so familiar when I started my walk, now felt like a distant memory, a vague trail that twisted and turned under the weight of the dense, towering trees above me. The woods had a way of doing that, making everything look different once the sun disappeared behind the horizon. I should have turned back by now, but I had always prided myself on not being afraid of the dark. I wasn't one to believe in stories about haunted woods or tales of creatures lurking in the shadows. My feet were sure as they moved along the narrow path, the only sound the steady crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot. The air was crisp, with a slight chill that made me pull my jacket tighter around my shoulders. But even though I had convinced myself that nothing was out of the ordinary, something in the back of my mind told me I wasn't alone. I stopped for a moment, scanning the forest around me. The trees stretched out like endless silhouettes, their branches gnarled and twisted in all directions. The wind had picked up slightly, but it wasn't enough to make the branches move in any noticeable way. The silence felt oppressive. It wasn't the kind of quiet that came from a peaceful forest at night, but the kind that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I started walking again, trying to push the unease from my mind. It was just the darkness playing tricks on me, I told myself. But the farther I walked, the more I felt the air closing in around me. The trees grew thicker, their trunks wider, their roots breaking through the ground like they were trying to claim the path itself. The once visible trail was now barely recognizable, covered in a thick layer of fallen leaves and undergrowth. I tried to follow the direction I thought I had been heading, but each step seemed to take me deeper into a part of the woods I didn't recognize. The further I went, the more isolated I felt. I was no longer on a trail at all. It was just me, the dark trees, and the eerie silence that had taken over the forest. I checked my phone, no service as usual in these parts, but the time seemed off. The sun had set barely an hour ago, yet it felt like I had been walking for much longer. I shoved the phone back into my pocket, cursing under my breath. I had always been confident in my sense of direction, but something was off. I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was shifting, like it was playing some kind of cruel trick on me. I stopped again, trying to steady my breath, but something caught my eye: movement in the trees. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a fox. But then the movement became more deliberate, too rhythmic, too slow. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. Just the dark, still trees, the shadows stretching farther with every passing second. I should have turned back then. I should have found my way back to the road, back to where it was safe. But the idea of turning around, retracing my steps, filled me with a deep sense of dread. I couldn't quite explain it, but the woods had changed. The air felt heavier, thick with something I couldn't identify. I wasn't just lost, I was trapped. I took a step forward, my foot catching on an exposed root. The sudden movement made me stumble, but I quickly regained my balance. As I did, I heard it again, another rustling. But this time it was closer, too close to ignore. My heart began to race, and I turned quickly, scanning the trees once more. But there was nothing. Nothing but the deep, suffocating silence. I kept walking, trying to push through the panic that was starting to build in my chest. I needed to find the way out, find something familiar. The woods didn't look like the same place I had entered. The trees now seemed to be closing in on me, their twisted branches reaching out, almost like they were trying to trap me. The path was gone, replaced by an unbroken sea of roots, leaves, and dark shadows. The air had turned cold, and I could see my breath in the air, sharp and quick. A gust of wind rushed through the trees, causing the leaves to rustle. But it wasn't the wind that made me freeze. It was the sound that followed, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. I didn't dare turn around. I couldn't bring myself to. I just kept walking, my pace quickening with every step. My mind was racing, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I was certain now whatever was following me was not a person. I wasn't even sure it was a thing that could be called a person. The ground sloped downward, and I realized with growing panic that I was heading toward a ravine. It wasn't a place I had seen before, not on any of my past hikes. I had no memory of the forest changing this way. The air smelled different here, damp, like decaying wood and wet moss. The woods had swallowed me up. I reached the edge of the ravine and peered down into the darkness. The steep drop made me hesitate, I couldn't hear anything except the rush of my own breath, and I felt the presence of whatever was behind me drawing closer. The footsteps were louder now, almost deliberate. I took a step back, but the moment I did, I heard a snap, a sharp, echoing crack that sent a jolt of terror through my body. It was the sound of something large breaking through the underbrush. It was too loud, too close. I turned and bolted, running without thinking. I knew I couldn't outrun whatever was behind me. The forest seemed to shift again, the trees closing in, the ground uneven beneath my feet. My lungs burned as I pushed myself harder, my legs trembling with every step. I was so focused on running that I barely noticed the change in the air. Suddenly, I burst through the trees and into an open space. My heart was hammering in my chest, my breathing ragged. But then I realized where I was. It was the clearing, the one I had passed earlier. But something was wrong. I could feel it. The air was thick, almost oppressive, and there was a weight to the space, like something heavy was pressing down on me. The trees around the clearing looked wrong, twisted, distorted, like they were part of something that didn't belong. My eyes darted around, scanning every inch of the clearing. I was trapped. The way back was gone. The path I had followed had vanished, leaving me with nothing but these strange, unnatural trees. I heard the footsteps again, but this time, they didn't stop. I spun around, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing in the shadow of the trees. But it wasn't a person. The shape was wrong, its outline shifting like it was made of darkness itself. My legs felt like jelly, and I fell to the ground, my hands shaking. The figure took a step forward, and I could feel it. I could feel the air around it, cold and suffocating. My heart pounded in my ears, my body frozen in fear. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure stopped. It tilted its head, as if examining me, and for a moment, everything went still. The figure moved, but not toward me. It moved away back into the trees. The footsteps faded, leaving me alone in the clearing. I stayed there for what felt like hours, unable to move, unable to process what had just happened. But eventually, the forest grew quiet again. The oppressive weight lifted. I wasn't sure how long I sat there, but when I finally stood up, the trees around me didn't seem so threatening. The path was back, clear and visible. I didn't know how it had happened, but I knew one thing for sure. I was done with this forest. I didn't care how many hikes I had taken before, how many paths I had walked. Something in those woods had changed, and I wasn't about to go back to figure out what it was. I left the clearing, my legs weak but moving, and didn't look back. When I finally made it to the edge of the woods, the first rays of dawn were breaking through the trees. I had survived the night, but the memory of what I had felt, what I had seen, would stay with me forever. It wasn't supposed to be anything special. A short hike in the woods just to clear my mind. I'd taken this route before, nothing more than a few hours' walk through familiar trails. The kind of thing you do to unwind, not expecting anything to change. But tonight, things felt different. I'd left home around dusk, just as the sun was dipping below the horizon. The woods were still lit by the last rays of light, casting long shadows across the path ahead. The air was cool, with the faint scent of pine and wet earth. I had my backpack with a bottle of water, some snacks, and a flashlight, just in case. I wasn't worried. I'd done this before and knew these woods like the back of my hand. I hadn't planned on staying too long, but as I walked, the beauty of the forest drew me in. The way the trees lined the path, their branches reaching out like a canopy, made it feel like I was walking in a secret world. The chirping of birds had died down, but there were still the occasional rustles in the underbrush, a rabbit or a squirrel, maybe a fox. It was peaceful, almost soothing. The sun set faster than I expected, and soon, the woods were plunged into a thick, inky darkness. I clicked on my flashlight, the beam of light cutting through the shadows, but even with the flashlight, the woods felt oppressive. The trees seemed taller now, and the sounds of the forest seemed to fade away. All I could hear was the crunch of my boots against the dirt and leaves, and my own breathing, steady but a little quicker than usual. I'd planned to reach the creek by nightfall. The sound of water would make for a perfect spot to sit and take a break, but by the time I arrived at the usual clearing near the stream, something felt off. The place seemed quieter than usual, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I took a step into the clearing, my flashlight casting long, strange shadows over the ground. I stopped and looked around. There was no wind, no sound, just the stillness. For a moment, I wondered if I'd missed something. The creek usually had a certain noise, the trickling of water over rocks, but it was eerily quiet. I glanced at the stream, and sure enough, there was no water. The creek was dry. It wasn't just low, it was completely barren. I walked over to the bank and knelt down to inspect it. The ground was cracked, the dirt parched. No water had flowed through here in days, maybe weeks. I couldn't understand it. There was no logical reason for a creek to dry up like this in the middle of summer. I rubbed the back of my neck, uneasy. This place had always been here, and it had always had water. I stood up, the flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. A rustle came from the trees behind me, just on the edge of the clearing. It wasn't a small noise, like a squirrel. It was deliberate, heavy, as if something larger had moved through the brush. I turned, shining the light in the direction of the noise, but the beam only revealed a few tangled branches and some low bushes. Nothing out of the ordinary. I stood still for a moment, listening. The rustling had stopped. I should have turned back. Something about the woods felt different tonight, and my instinct was screaming at me to leave. But instead, I told myself it was just my imagination. It had to be. There was nothing out here. I couldn't be the only one in these woods. People hiked here all the time. I moved deeper into the forest, following the narrow trail that would eventually lead back to the parking lot. But with every step, the air seemed to thicken. The trees seemed to lean in closer, and the path became less defined. It was as if the forest was swallowing me whole. I should have been able to find my way back by now, but the darkness made everything look unfamiliar. I checked my watch. It wasn't that late, but something was wrong. The woods felt too quiet, too still. My flashlight beam shook as I turned around, checking behind me. But there was nothing. No sounds of animals, no distant rustling, no wind. Just an oppressive silence. I walked faster now, my heart beginning to beat harder in my chest. The trees seemed to be growing closer together, the branches tangled in a way that made it feel like the path was narrowing. It was harder to see even with the flashlight. The beam of light flickered for a second, and when it came back on, the forest had changed. It wasn't the same. The trees seemed more twisted, their bark dark and rough. The branches gnarled like fingers reaching out to grab me. The path ahead was now barely visible. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. Something wasn't right. The woods had always been dark at night, but this wasn't just darkness. It was something more. I turned around, but there was no sign of the clearing, no sign of the creek. I was deep in the woods now, and the path I had been following had disappeared completely. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I realized that I had no idea where I was. My phone was in my backpack, but I hadn't thought to check it. Now, I didn't want to. I could feel it. The woods were alive in a way they hadn't been before. I tried to move forward, but the trees now seemed to block my way. The air felt thick and heavy, pressing in on me. I stepped off the path and into the brush, my boots crunching on the dry leaves. But the ground seemed to give way underneath me. I stumbled, my ankle twisting as I caught myself on a nearby tree. Pain shot up my leg, but I didn't have time to think about it. I had to get out. I pushed forward, my mind racing. I was lost, completely lost. The flashlight was the only thing that kept me from completely losing my bearings, but the beam was weak now, flickering with every step. I didn't know how much longer the batteries would last. Suddenly, I heard it again. A sound from behind me, the rustling, that same deliberate movement through the brush. This time, it was closer, too close. My heart hammered in my chest, and I spun around, shining the flashlight into the darkness. But there was nothing there, just trees, shadows. I froze. A shape moved in the distance just at the edge of the light. It was large, too large to be an animal. I blinked, trying to focus, but the shadows played tricks on my eyes. My throat tightened, and I tried to tell myself it was just the forest, just the wind. But something inside me screamed to run, and so I did. I bolted down the path, my legs aching, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The flashlight flickered again, and for a brief moment, everything went black. I cursed under my breath, desperately tapping the side of the flashlight. It flickered back to life, and I saw it. The figure. It was moving through the trees, following me. It wasn't human. The shape was too tall, too long. Its movement wasn't natural. It glided between the trees, almost as if it was floating. My stomach churned with a wave of nausea. Couldn't breathe. My legs wouldn't move fast enough, and I could hear it gaining on me. I ran, faster than I ever thought possible, my pulse roaring in my ears. My foot caught on a root, and I went sprawling into the dirt. Pain shot through my body, but I didn't stop. I scrambled to my feet and kept going, my only thought to put distance between myself and whatever was following me. It wasn't until I reached the edge of the woods that I stopped. I didn't know how far I had run, but I could see the dim outline of the road ahead. The forest seemed to recede behind me, as though I had crossed some invisible line. The figure was gone, but I could still feel it in the pit of my stomach. I didn't look back. I didn't stop running until I reached the car. And even then, I didn't feel safe. The woods had changed. The trees had closed in on me in a way that was unnatural. Whatever had followed me, whatever it was, I didn't want to know. I drove home, hands shaking on the wheel, and didn't say a word to anyone about what had happened. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't explain the twisted trees, the way the forest seemed alive, or the thing I had felt watching me. All I knew was that I would never go back into those woods. Not ever.